We are often taught that the guillotine was the French Revolution's ultimate instrument of terror, but beneath that bloody spectacle lies a darkness far more profound. The blade was in truth a mercy. The actual horror was the calculated dismantling of a human soul that preceded it, a 76-day descent into a living hell. In the suffocating summer of 1793, Marie Antoinette had ceased to be a queen. She was merely prisoner 280. The Jacobins did not simply desire her execution. They demanded her absolute degradation. To validate their republic, they believed they had to prove that the woman behind the crown was not a human being, but a monster deserving of an agonizing psychological vivisection. Join our inquiry into the abyss by subscribing and tell me in the comments from which city are you witnessing this tragedy unfold. To understand the sheer magnitude of the violation that was about to take place, one must first understand the stage upon which this tragedy was set. The temple was not merely a prison. It was a medieval fortress built centuries earlier by the Knights Templar, a structure of imposing stone and suffocating history that seemed to loom over Paris like a dark monolith. By 1793, it had become the tomb of the French monarchy. Imagine, if you will, the sensory deprivation of such a place. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and rotting straw, a miasma that clung to the back of the throat and refused to leave. The walls were so thick that the sounds of the bustling city outside were reduced to a dull, meaningless hum, leaving the prisoners trapped in a silence that was heavy enough to crush the spirit. Inside this stone sarcophagus, Marie Antoinette was no longer the dazzling figure of Versailles, adorned in silk and diamonds. She was a widow, dressed in mourning black, her face etched with the lines of grief and sleeplessness. Yet within these damp walls, she had carved out a fragile sanctuary. Her existence had shrunk to the four walls of her chamber, but it was an existence she clung to with desperate ferocity, because it contained the only treasures she had left: her children, Marie-Thérèse, her teenage daughter, and Louis Charles, the 8-year-old boy who was now in the eyes of the royalists, King Louis XVI. For months, the rhythm of their life had been dictated by the turning of heavy iron keys and the watchful eyes of the National Guard. But there was still a semblance of humanity. She taught them lessons. She mended their clothes. She watched them sleep, holding on to the simple primal comfort of their breathing in the dark. But the Committee of Public Safety, that shadowy cabal of revolutionaries who now held the reins of France, looked upon this domestic scene, not with sympathy, but with deep suspicion. They realized that as long as the boy remained with his mother, he was a symbol, a seed of the old regime that might one day sprout again. And so they came to a cold, bureaucratic decision. To kill the monarchy, they did not just need to execute the queen. They needed to sever the bond between mother and son. They needed to extract the boy and remold him in the image of the revolution. The atmosphere in the temple changed subtly at first. The guards became less communicative, their faces hardening into masks of indifference. New restrictions were implemented without explanation. But nothing could have prepared prisoner 280 for the night of July 3rd, 1793. It was a night that would be etched into the memory of Marie-Thérèse forever. A night she would later describe in her memoirs with a trembling hand. The hour was late, near 10 o'clock at night. The heavy summer heat of Paris had finally given way to the cool of the evening and the prisoners had retired. Marie Antoinette had just settled Louis Charles into his bed. Because of the constant surveillance and the fear that gripped her heart, she had not let the boy out of her sight. Since his father was dragged to the guillotine 6 months prior, she slept beside him, her hand often resting on his chest to reassure herself that his heart was still beating. The room was quiet save for the scratching of mice in the wainscoting and the distant rhythmic pacing of the sentries below. And then the silence was shattered. It began as a low rumble echoing up the spiral stone staircase, the sound of heavy boots, not one man but many, the distinctive clatter of weaponry against stone. metal on stone, getting louder, getting closer. Marie Antoinette sat up in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew the schedule of the patrols, and this was not a routine inspection. This was an invasion. The door to their chamber did not open, it exploded inward. 6 men flooded into the small room, the flickering light of their lanterns casting long distorted shadows against the peeling walls. These were not the usual jailers. These were municipal officers, their sashes of office looking like wounds across their chests. One of them stepped forward, unfolding a document with a crisp, officious snap. It was a decree from the Committee of Public Safety. The order was brief, brutal, and absolute. The citizen Louis Charles was to be separated from his mother and transferred to a separate apartment within the tower for the purposes of re-education. For a moment the words hung in the air like smoke. Marie Antoinette did not scream. Not yet. She stood up, placing her body physically between the men and the bed where her son lay sleeping. It was an instinctive movement, a primal barrier of flesh and bone. When the reality of what they were saying finally sank in, the transformation was terrifying to behold. The composed, dignified queen vanished. In her place stood a lioness. She refused. She told them simply and flatly that they would not take him. When the guards moved to step around her, she threw herself against them. Primary sources describe a scene of absolute chaos. This was not a polite royal objection, it was a physical brawl. She clung to the bedpost. She clung to the door frame. She shielded the waking, terrified boy with her own body. She screamed that they would have to kill her first, that the only way they would take her son was over her dead body. The boy Louis Charles woke up in a state of terror, seeing his mother fighting with strange men, hearing the raised voices, the threats, the violence. He began to weep uncontrollably. His sister, Marie-Thérèse, and his aunt, Madame Elizabeth, joined the fray, begging the men to show mercy. But mercy was a currency that had long since been devalued in revolutionary France. The standoff lasted for an entire hour, 60 minutes of screaming, pleading, and physical struggle. Imagine the psychological toll of that hour. Every second was a battle, every breath was a prayer. The guards grew impatient. They had their orders, and they were not accustomed to being defied by a woman, even a former queen. They escalated their threats. They did not just threaten to drag the boy away by force. They threatened to kill Marie-Thérèse. They told Marie Antoinette that if she did not step aside, they would execute her daughter right there in the room. This was the breaking point. The cruel calculus of the situation became clear. If she continued to fight, she would lose both of them. To save her daughter, she had to sacrifice her son. The fight went out of her all at once. Her shoulders slumped and she stepped back, gasping for air. Her hair disheveled, her dress torn. But no, she went to the bed and lifted the sobbing 8-year-old boy into her arms. She carried him to the center of the room. She did not weep then. She was beyond tears. She smoothed his hair. She wiped the tears from his cheeks. She whispered words to him that the guards could not hear, private covenants of love that belonged only to them. And then, with a trembling hand, she surrendered him. She watched as they took him by the arms. She watched as they led him out the door. She watched his small face looking back at her, filled with confusion and terror. And then the heavy oak door slammed shut. The sound of the lock turning was final. It was the sound of a coffin closing. For Marie Antoinette, the guillotine that awaited her months later would be a relief. The true execution had just taken place. She had lost her crown. She had lost her husband. And now she had lost the future. She collapsed onto the floor, not in a faint but in a state of catatonic despair. She would spend the next several hours staring at the door, waiting for a sound that would never come again. But the revolutionaries were not done. Taking the boy was only the first step. What they intended to do to him, and by extension to her, was a form of cruelty so sophisticated, so perverse, that it would make the simple act of beheading seem like an act of charity. They were about to send Louis Charles to the workshop of a man named Antoine Simon, and the lessons he would learn there were designed to dismantle his soul piece by piece. To comprehend the full extent of the horror that followed, one must look away from the weeping mother for a moment and descend into the darkness where they took the son. Louis Charles was not thrown into a dungeon. That would have been too simple, too medieval. Instead, he was placed into the care of a man named Antoine Simon. History remembers Simon as a cobbler, a shoemaker by trade. But in the summer of 1793, he was something far more sinister. He was the Republic's chosen instrument of indoctrination. His instructions from the Committee of Public Safety were vague, yet terrifyingly clear. He was not to kill the boy. He was not to poison him. He was to get rid of him, and Simon understood exactly what that meant. He was to get rid of the prince, so that only the citizen remained. The re-education of Louis Charles was a brutal exercise in psychological deconstruction. They stripped him of his mourning clothes, the last physical connection to his executed father, and forced him to wear the bonnet rouge, the red cap of the revolutionaries. But clothes were merely the surface. The true violation was internal. The primary sources from this period paint a picture of a slow, grinding destruction of innocence. Simon and his wife were given an unlimited budget for food and wine, not for themselves, but for the child. They forced alcohol upon him. They made him drink until his senses were dull, until the memories of his mother's prayers were replaced by the fog of intoxication. Day after day, the cobbler taught the boy a new vocabulary. He was forbidden from speaking the refined French of the court. Instead, he was drilled in the vulgar slang of the Parisian streets. He was taught to curse God, to curse the aristocracy, and most painfully of all, to curse his own mother. And here is the detail that truly haunts the historical record. Marie Antoinette was still in the tower. She was kept on the floor above. The floors of the temple were thick, but they were not soundproof. In the dead of night, when the prison was silent, the former queen would lie awake on her straw mattress, and she would hear. Drifting up through the ventilation shafts and the floorboards came the sound of drunken laughter. She heard the clinking of glasses, and then she heard the voice, her son's voice, no longer sweet and innocent, but slurred and aggressive, singing the revolutionary anthems that called for her own death. She heard him repeating the obscenities Simon had taught him, using words he could not possibly understand to desecrate the family he had been torn from. For a mother, this auditory torture was a blade sharper than any guillotine. To know that your child is suffering is one thing. To hear his soul being warped, to hear him slowly turning into the very monsters who imprisoned you, is a despair that transcends language. She spent her days pacing the cell, stopping at every noise, straining her ears for a fragment of the boy she used to know. But that boy was fading. He was being hollowed out, filled with hatred and lies prepared for the final act of betrayal that was yet to come. But the revolutionaries were not content with merely breaking her heart. They needed to break her body and her spirit completely. On the night of August 1st, 1793, the next phase of her calvary began. It was 2 a.m, the witching hour. Marie Antoinette was awakened by the now familiar sound of armed men entering her cell. But this time, they didn't come for a child. They came for her. They told her to pack her meager belongings. She was being transferred. She was allowed no goodbyes. She could not embrace her daughter Marie-Thérèse one last time. She could not kiss her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. She was marched down the spiral stairs past the room where her son was being held captive, leaving him behind in the darkness. She was taken to the Conciergerie. If the temple was a prison, the Conciergerie was a waiting room for the grave. Situated on the banks of the Seine, it was known as the antechamber of death. It was here that prisoners spent their final days before the tumbrils arrived to carry them to the scaffold. Marie Antoinette was thrown into a cell that was below ground level. The air here was different. It smelled of the river of ancient mold and of unwashed bodies. Moisture dripped from the stone arches above, forming slick puddles on the uneven floor. She was no longer referred to by name. In the ledger of the jailer, she was simply prisoner number 280. The conditions of her confinement were designed to strip away the last vestiges of her dignity. Her cell was small, roughly 12 feet square, but the size was not the torture. The torture was the gaze. The Committee of Public Safety had ordered that she was to be under constant surveillance. 2 gendarmes, 2 armed soldiers were stationed inside her cell 24 hours a day. They were ordered never to take their eyes off her. Imagine the psychological weight of that unblinking stare. She was a woman of 37, but her health was rapidly failing. She suffered from frequent hemorrhages, likely a symptom of advanced uterine cancer, or the sheer physiological toll of chronic stress. She was bleeding, she was in pain, she was weak, and yet she was never alone. To provide a mockery of decency, the guards set up a small folding screen, a privacy screen roughly 4 feet high. Behind this flimsy barrier, Marie Antoinette was expected to wash herself, to change her soiled linens, to use the chamber pot. But the screen was too low to offer real concealment, and the guards were too close. They could hear every rustle of fabric, every gasp of pain, every splash of water. They sat there smoking their pipes, playing cards and watching the top of the screen, waiting for a glimpse of the fallen queen. This was the weaponization of shame. For a woman raised in the rigid protocols of the Austrian court where privacy was a sacred privilege, this enforced intimacy with strange men was a daily violation. It was a form of sexual humiliation designed to remind her that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state. It was a specimen to be observed, to be guarded, to be catalogued before it was finally destroyed. Yet even in this squalor, something remarkable happened. The primary sources tell us that Marie Antoinette did not scream. She did not rage. She went quiet. She retreated into a fortress of silence within herself. She sat for hours on her wooden chair, staring at the damp wall, her fingers working a piece of embroidery until the guards took away her needles, fearing she might use them to commit suicide. Deprived of her needles, she pulled threads from the hangings of the wall and wove them together. Her appearance began to change drastically. In those final weeks, the transformation was shocking. Her hair, once the envy of Europe, turned stark white. Not grey, but white. The medical term is canietis subita, commonly known as Marie Antoinette syndrome. It happens when extreme stress triggers an autoimmune response that attacks the pigment in the hair follicles. Her body was literally consuming itself from the inside out. Her eyes, once bright and lively, sank deep into their sockets, surrounded by dark bruises of exhaustion. She lost so much weight that her black mourning dress hung off her skeletal frame like a shroud, and yet she was still dangerous. The revolutionaries knew that a dead queen makes a martyr. To execute her, they needed to destroy her character so thoroughly that no one would dare mourn her. They needed a crime so heinous that it would justify the blade, and since they could not find evidence of treason in her papers, since they could not prove she had betrayed France to the Austrians, they decided to manufacture a crime. They looked at the broken alcoholic boy in the cobbler's workshop, and they saw their weapon. They were about to coerce the son into destroying the mother. The trial began on October 14th, 1793, but to call it a trial is to insult the very concept of justice. It was a spectacle, a theatrical production staged by the Revolutionary Tribunal with the sole purpose of feeding the mob. The courtroom was packed to capacity. The air was stifling hot, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of bloodlust. At the center of this maelstrom sat Marie Antoinette. She was dressed in her threadbare widow's weeds. She was pale, emaciated, and clearly in pain. Yet she held her head with a regality that no dungeon could erase. Facing her was the public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, a man whose job was to ensure that the guillotine never went hungry. For hours he unleashed a torrent of accusations. He accused her of squandering the nation's treasury. He accused her of sending French military secrets to her Austrian relatives. He accused her of orchestrating orgies at Versailles. These were the standard lies, the political mud that had been slung at her for years. Marie Antoinette answered them with a calm, almost bored detachment. She tapped her fingers on the arm of her chair. She corrected dates. She pointed out logical fallacies. She was winning. Fouquier-Tinville realized that the trial was slipping away from him. The evidence was weak, and the Queen's composure was making the revolution look petty. He needed something more, something so shocking, so vile that it would dehumanize her completely in the eyes of the jury. And so he reached for the document that had been manufactured in the cobbler's workshop. He called Jacques Hébert, a radical journalist, to the stand. Hébert unfolded a piece of paper and began to read the testimony of 8-year-old Louis Charles. The courtroom went deathly silent. The accusation was an abomination. The boy had signed a statement claiming that his mother and his aunt, Madame Elizabeth, had taught him secret practices. It was a thinly veiled accusation of incest. They were accusing a mother of sexually abusing her own son. It was the ultimate taboo, the final attempt to paint Marie Antoinette not just as a traitor, but as a beast, a moral leper who had violated the most sacred laws of nature. The calculated cruelty of this moment is difficult to overstate. They had tortured a confused, terrified child into signing a lie, and now they were using that lie to destroy his mother in a public forum. Marie Antoinette, who had remained stoic through hours of political slander, physically recoiled. Her face drained of all colour. For a moment she said nothing. A juror asked her why she did not answer the charge. It was then that prisoner 280 rose from her chair. The physical movement was sudden and sharp. She looked past the judges, past the prosecutor, past the jury. She looked directly into the crowd, specifically at the women, the market wives, the fisherwomen, the very people who had come to jeer at her. Her voice, previously low and controlled, cracked with raw emotion. "If I have not replied," she cried out, "it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge laid against a mother." She paused, her chest heaving. "I appeal to all mothers in this room. Is there a single one among you who would not shudder at such an accusation?" The effect was electric. The courtroom erupted, not with anger at the Queen, but with shock at the prosecutor. In that moment, the political divide vanished. Every woman in that room, regardless of her politics, understood the primal bond between mother and child. They understood that a line had been crossed. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Fouquier-Tinville had overplayed his hand. He had tried to create a monster, but he had accidentally revealed a human being. But the verdict was never in doubt. The sympathy of the crowd could not save her from the machinery of the terror. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, after a trial that had lasted 2 days and nights without rest, she was condemned to death. She was taken back to her cell at the Conciergerie for her final hours. It is here in the shadow of the guillotine that we see the final victory of Marie Antoinette's spirit. She asked for pen and paper. With death waiting at the door, she sat down and wrote a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. This document, which was intercepted and never delivered, is one of the most heartbreaking artifacts of the 18th century. It is not the letter of a politician, it is the letter of a mother. She wrote, "I am calm as people are whose conscience is clear. I deeply regret leaving my poor children, you know, that I only lived for them." She urged her son never to seek revenge for her death. She forgave her enemies. There was no hate in her words, only a profound sorrow and an overwhelming love. She signed it not as Queen of France, but simply Marie Antoinette. She folded the letter, kissed it, and handed it to the guard bolt, hoping it would reach her family. It would sit in a drawer in Robespierre's office for years, gathering dust while her family waited for a word that would never come. The sun rose on October 16th, 1793. The executioner, Henri Sanson, arrived at the cell. The final humiliations began. She was ordered to remove her black mourning dress. She was forced to change into a simple white chemise, the uniform of the condemned. When she asked to change in private behind the screen, the guard refused, ordering her to undress in front of him. She crouched down low against the wall, trying to shield her body with her own arms, preserving her modesty to the very last. Then came the shears. Sanson roughly gathered her white hair and hacked it off at the neck to ensure the blade of the guillotine would have a clean path. He bound her hands behind her back with thick, rough rope. She flinched. When her husband the king was executed, his hands had been tied with a handkerchief, and he had been allowed a closed carriage. Marie Antoinette was granted no such mercy. The rope bit into her wrists, cutting off the circulation. She was led out into the Cour du Mai. She expected a carriage. Instead, she saw a tumbril, a dirty open cart used for hauling manure or lumber. She was forced to climb onto a wooden plank facing backward. The gates opened, and the cart lurched into the streets of Paris. The journey to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour. It was a slow, agonizing procession designed to expose her to the maximum amount of abuse. Thousands of people lined the streets. They spat, they screamed, they threw garbage. But the woman sitting in that cart did not flinch. The artist Jacques-Louis David sketched her from a window as she passed. His drawing remains the most haunting image of that day. It shows a woman who has been stripped of everything. Her hair is jagged under a simple cap. Her cheeks are hollow. Her nose is sharp. She looks old beyond her years, but her back is straight. Her eyes are closed. She is no longer in Paris. She has retreated so deep inside herself that the screams of the mob can no longer touch her. She is already gone. When the cart finally arrived at the foot of the scaffold, she climbed the steps without assistance. Her legs were weak, but her will was iron. And then, in the final seconds of her life, a moment of accidental poetry occurred. As she moved toward the plank, she stumbled and stepped on the foot of the executioner, Henri Sanson. She stopped. She turned to the man who was about to kill her, and she spoke her final words. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose. It was not a plea. It was an apology. In the face of a revolution that had tried to strip her of her humanity, she responded with an act of politeness. It was the ultimate defiance. They could take her crown, they could take her children, they could take her life, but they could not take her grace. At 12:15 p.m. the blade fell. The crowd roared. But the silence that followed in history is deafening. The French revolutionaries believed that by killing Marie Antoinette, they were exorcising a demon. They believed that by subjecting her to 76 days of psychological torture, they would reveal the corruption at the heart of the monarchy. They wanted to show the world a trembling coward, a debauched monster. Instead, they revealed a mother. By stripping away the silk and the diamonds, by taking away the palace and the servants, they accidentally distilled her down to her essence. And what remained was not the villain of their propaganda, but a woman of extraordinary resilience. A woman who endured the unendurable. A woman who, when faced with the unspeakable accusation weaponized by her own son, chose to appeal to the universal bond of motherhood rather than hate. History is often written by the victors, but in the case of Prisoner 280, the victors lost control of the narrative. The guillotine ended her life, but the 76 days that preceded it defined her legacy. It forces us to ask a question that echoes through the centuries, darker and more uncomfortable than any political debate. When a society strips a human being of everything, dignity, privacy, family, and hope, and that human being still refuses to break, who is the true monster? the woman in the cot, or the cheering crowd watching her bleed. The blade may have been sharp, but the silence of the empty cell she left behind cuts far deeper.